Hello and welcome to this episode of Parley. I'm Aaratrika Bhaumik, your host for today, and the question for this week is: should legislatures in India have fixed tenures? Under the Westminster system of government followed in India, legislatures do not have fixed tenures. They may be dissolved by the government, which then calls for fresh elections, or they may lapse if a government falls and no alternative government can be formed. However, the bills introduced in the Lok Sabha on December 17th, aimed at implementing simultaneous elections, propose a fixed 5-year term for the Lok Sabha, with elections to state legislatures synchronized to this cycle. In the event that the Lok Sabha or any state assembly is dissolved before the completion of its full term, mid-term elections will be held only for the remainder of the 5-year term. To discuss this contentious issue, we are joined today by Mr. P.D.T. Achary, former Secretary General of the Lok Sabha, and Mr. M.R. Madhavan, co-founder and president of the PRS Legislative Research. I welcome you both. Thank you so much for joining us today. Mr. Achary, if I may begin with you, do you think that fixed legislative tenures promote better governance by reducing the disruptions of frequent elections?
Well, the Constitution actually provides for a 5-year term for both the assemblies and the Lok Sabha. But it also says that unless sooner dissolved, that means it can be dissolved. That provision was made realizing the political reality or anticipating the political realities that will emerge in the course of the working of the Constitution. Now, we have seen that up to 1967, the assemblies and Lok Sabha had a fixed term of 5 years. They continued for 5 years. And after that, of course, there were some cases of instability in the assemblies, and many assemblies had to be dissolved midterm, and then elections had to be held, and so on. And then Parliament also had to be dissolved, and then elections were held midterm. So the entire cycle got broken there. And after that, it was not possible for holding simultaneous elections to Parliament, Lok Sabha and the assemblies. Now the question is whether a fixed term is good, or the kind of provision that has been made in the Constitution is okay, or that is better. Well, I would say, of course, it's better to have a 5-year term, but at the same time, we have to actually account for any kind of political instability that happens in our country. These cannot be anticipated. It happens due to various factors. So that also has to be factored in. And that is why this provision has been made, that unless sooner dissolved, that means it can be dissolved. In fact, in the case of states, sometimes the government feels that towards the, maybe when they have another 1 or 2 years to complete, they take a decision to hold a midterm poll and dissolve the assembly and go in for election, because they may think that that was the most opportune time for a fresh election, so that they could come back with a renewed mandate. This kind of thing can happen in politics. And therefore, the Constitution also has to kind of provide for these sort of situations that may emerge. And therefore, so far as your question is concerned, whether a fixed term is good for the legislatures, well, I would say fixed term is good. But at the same time, you must make allowance for such eventualities.
Mr. Madhavan, do you agree with Mr. Achary on this, that simultaneous polls in fixed terms will ensure that political parties in the country are not constantly in electioneering mode?
So it's not just a question of electioneering. Your question was whether it promotes better governance. Now, this particular Constitution Amendment Bill actually doesn't have fixed term in the strict sense, because it does allow for midterm elections. So in that sense, it does allow for accountability to the legislature, because the parliamentary system hinges on the fact that the government of the day at every point of time has to have the confidence of the legislature. And if it loses the confidence, it has to go. And that is how the accountability of the government to the legislature is maintained. And that, I would say, is part of the basic structure. And this particular bill does allow that to happen. So, in that sense, it's in conformity with the overall picture of the basic structure. What it changes is that if there is a midterm poll and there are new elections at that time, the new term, the term of the new legislature elected, will not be 5 years, but would be curtailed. That is the significant difference. So, the question of whether it promotes better governance or not, I think that's an open question. But this does not guarantee stability for 5 years, unlike, let us say, a presidential system where the president of the United States, for instance, cannot be removed except by impeachment for wrongdoing, not because the legislature or someone else is not in favor of the policies being made by the president. So, in that sense, this does conform to the overall principles of parliamentary democracy, which is at every point of time the government is accountable to the legislature.
An argument that has been proposed by opposition parties is that altering the tenure of state assemblies to align with that of the Lok Sabha undermines federalism and also threatens political plurality. Mr. Madhavan, do you share these concerns?
When I look at the bill, it's actually symmetrical. It also aligns the tenure of parliament to that of state assemblies. I'll explain that. For example, let's say the government at the center falls at the end of 3 years. Now there'll be fresh elections to Lok Sabha. That will be the new parliament will be for new Lok Sabha will be for 2 years. So it's incorrect to say that you're aligning state assemblies to parliament. You're just aligning everybody to a particular date. So I personally don't see any federalism issue here.
Mr. Achary, what is your opinion on this?
See, the basic question as I look at it, is that for the first time, the tenure of the state assemblies is made to depend on the tenure of parliament, because that is the basic approach in this bill, as I understand it. Of course, as Mr. Madhavan says, that there is a provision that parliament, if there is a midterm poll, say after 3 years or something, the next parliament will have only 2-year term. But then what happens to the assemblies, which are already in place? When the assembly's tenure is linked to parliament, assembly's term is made to depend on the tenure of parliament. If the parliament, for example, completes its term, at that time, maybe an assembly will be in its second year, assembly will have to be dissolved. And elections have to be held along with parliament. This kind of thing. That approach, according to me, is against the federal principles, because, see, here in the constitutional scheme that we have, parliament means Lok Sabha, and the state assemblies are kind of independent. Assemblies are not under the control of parliament. They are autonomous legislative bodies, so far as the state is concerned. And they have a fixed term. The constitution has fixed a fixed term of 5 years for assemblies. And so the Lok Sabha also has a term of 5 years. Now here, for the first time, the assembly's tenure is being made to depend on the tenure of the Lok Sabha. And thereby, so tenure of a legislative body is, or rather fixed tenure of a legislative body, is an important marker of the federal system or federal arrangement. That is being disturbed by this bill.
Proponents of the bill or such a system of fixed legislative tenures, however, argue that such a system could deter attempts to destabilize governments and also curb practices like horse trading. We've also seen flagrant violation of the anti-defection law in the recent past. So, do you think that such practices can be curbed, Mr. Achary, through such a system?
This is something new which is being tried, and we cannot anticipate what will happen. Anti-defection law even now is being abused. It is not being properly followed in many cases, and it has its own story. But here the point is, for the first time, the tenure of the assembly has become very uncertain. When it is made to depend on the tenure of the parliament or the Lok Sabha, that means the assembly has lost its autonomy so far as the tenure is concerned, the independence so far as the tenure is concerned, because that is also a part of the independence of the legislative unit in a state. After all, in a federal setup that we have, although it has very strong unitary features, but still it is called a federal republic because of the division of the legislative power. As I said in the earlier, that this is an important marker of the federal arrangement that we have in our country, and that is being shaken up through this bill.
My understanding of the bill is that it's only for the first time when you're getting the dates in alignment that the assembly's tenure will be till the parliament's end. After that, let's say 2 or 3 cycles down the line, if parliament has a midterm election, assemblies will continue, they will not be dissolved. So everybody goes till the date of originally decided date where simultaneous elections will again take place. So assemblies will continue. Now the question about whether it will curb practices, as you put it in your words, like horse trading, I actually don't think there would, I don't know, we don't know what will happen, but unlikely to have any impact. Just see, for example, events like what have happened in India, in this, especially in states, over the last several years. We had large-scale defections, let's say in Madhya Pradesh, in Karnataka, but all that happened was by-election. Those particular MLAs resigned or were disqualified. Typically, they resigned, and there were by-elections to only those seats. And something like that is not being deterred by this bill at all. So all of that, I don't see any reason why it will be affected by this bill. What is actually be interesting is to see, the implications will be, for example, if there is a dissolution of the House. So let's say within the 5-year tenure, the government falls at the end of, let's say, 3.5 years. So you will have to have midterm polls. It takes us about 6 months, 4 months to 6 months to hold the elections. So we will actually be electing a Lok Sabha with a tenure of 1 year, or if it's in the 4th year, you'll be actually electing a government, a Lok Sabha, which will form a government which will have a tenure of less than a year. I don't know whether that is a desirable outcome.
Thank you, Mr. Madhavan. A lot of experts have also flagged that the bills do not account for, like we've discussed earlier, for political exigencies. For instance, what happens in case of a hung legislature with no clear majority? Or if the ruling party splits but the breakaway faction refuses to side with the opposition. So, Mr. Madhavan, if you could just let our listeners know as to whether these bills actually address these stalemates.
Actually, I don't see a problem in this bill with that. For example, let's just take, for example, a situation like what happened in Delhi in 2013 or in Bihar in 2005. So in Delhi, the government was formed. It was a 3-way party, Congress, AAP and BJP. And initially, AAP took the support of Congress. That was withdrawn. And there was no way any two of these 3 parties could get together. So we had to have midterm polls. Now, under this dispensation, there will be midterm polls and the new legislature will be elected for a period of 3 years or 3.5 years or 4 years or whatever, not for 5 years. So that will continue. So this will not, this bill as it has been introduced enables stalemates to be resolved through a fresh election, except that the term of the legislature now being elected would be curtailed. It will not be 5 years, it will be shorter than 5 years.
Right. Thank you. Mr. Achary, what is your opinion on this?
Where is the need for this bill? First of all, let's just think about it. Where is the need for this? Is it necessary? Is it such a great priority item that we must have simultaneous polls and all that? First of all, I don't agree with the argument that this is being thought of as a great measure to curb the electoral expenditure. In my view, that is not a very credible argument at all. Because after all, the election expenditure has 2 parts. One is the money that is spent by the Election Commission and the state governments in connection with the elections, for which the budget provisions are made by both the central government and the state governments. If you go through that, it may be a few thousand rupees, 2,000 crores rupees altogether. But the bulk of the election expenditure is incurred by the political parties. And the last election, actually, there was some estimate done by somebody. It shows that 1.35 lakh crores rupees was spent in the last election, which was held recently to the parliament. So that is the kind of money that is spent in the election. Well, now the question is whether this money can be usefully diverted to infrastructure building. Will any political party do that? And therefore, the whole idea, the whole talk about election expenditure being the basis of this bill, to curb the election expenditure, we are thinking about simultaneous elections. I don't think it is a very credible kind of argument. And therefore, in my view, this bill and the simultaneous election is not at all necessary. Because in my view, actually, I would always prefer frequent elections, because the representatives of the people will have to go back to the people again and again, and the accountability can be ensured by that. Otherwise, if you hold elections once in 5 years, that means the representatives of the people, will almost forget the people, because only in the last year they will try to renew their contracts with the people and all that. This kind of a trend, will set in once this kind of arrangement sets in, and you will hold elections only once in 5 years. And so that is how I look at the whole thing. So in my view, this bill and this whole thing that is being done, this legislative measure, which is not necessary at all in the present situation. So the present arrangement should continue. That would be healthy for Indian politics, because that will ensure accountability. And then, so far as the humongous amount of money that is spent in the elections is concerned, you switch over to the funding of elections by the state in various stages. Make a start, make a beginning, do that, and then you will be able to curb this humongous expenditure that is incurred by political parties in the elections.
Since we are talking about political stalemates, do you believe that the German model of a constructive vote of no confidence could resolve such issues? Of course, this is a proposal that was rejected by the high level committee chaired by former President Ramnath Kovind. But Mr. Achary, do you think that such a proposal maybe warrants reconsideration?
Well, this has been discussed in this country. It is not the first time that has been discussed. It was discussed earlier also, that we should adopt that kind of a thing, which is not possible in this country. I don't think there is any possibility of that kind of an idea being tried in our country.
And Mr. Madhavan, do you agree with this? Do you think such a proposal would not work here?
I don't think it's practical given our system. I'll just give you an example. Okay, let us say there is a government which loses a no confidence motion, and there is no alternate government which is being formed. And then the old government continues. This is the German form, right? Now, the old government remains in power. It does not have a majority in the House. So whatever it tries to do, its bills, its budgets, every item will be defeated in the House. But so the government cannot actually function because it cannot move any of its programs or even its budget. But it continues to be in power, which is a very strange way to be in power. So I don't think it's a practical solution at all.
Proceeding to the last question for the evening, if we were to look at international practices, In the United Kingdom, the Fixed Term Parliaments Act of 2011 was revoked in 2022. Many experts were of the opinion that such a law often caused a constitutional crisis and also policy paralysis. Mr. Madhavan, do you think there are lessons here for India?
Well, it didn't work in the UK, right? I mean, they did have, after the first round of 5 years, they had midterm elections, uh, and they actually could not manage a fixed term. And this comes back to the whole idea that if a government in a parliamentary system has to be continue to be in power, that particular government has to have the confidence of a majority of the members of the legislature. This is a basic principle. And once you have that principle, that is not in conformity with having a fixed tenure of any legislature. And just to clarify, the current constitutional amendment bill is being mistakenly seen as a fixed term. It is not a fixed term, it is a maximum term. So its term is 5 years or less because it allows midterm. And in case there is a midterm, its term will be shorter than 5 years or less if there is another midterm. So that is what this bill is proposing. It is not proposing a fixed tenure.
Mr. Achary, any concluding thoughts on this?
Under our constitution, a government which loses majority in the House cannot continue in any shape, because the government will have to be collectively responsible to the legislature. And then the legislature will have to make some other arrangements. Either there is an alternative government, if it is possible, it can come to power and continue, or there will be a dissolution of the House. If no government is possible to be formed, then there will be a dissolution of the House and elections will be held. That is a process which has been continuing. And that, in my view, in our country, that such a thing cannot be avoided. Political instability can take place. You cannot presume that it will not take place in any country, in any state. It can happen. Mostly it can happen in the states. And the possibility of such a thing happening at the center is very less. Therefore, we can say that safely that Parliament, of course, will have a 5-year term, whether it is fixed term or whether it is midterm. Actually, the term is 5 years. That is what the Constitution says. The term of an assembly or term of the Lok Sabha is 5 years, unless sooner dissolved. Well, that is an eventuality that happens sometimes, but not always. So my concluding thoughts is that the present system, with all its imperfections, and no system is perfect that way, should continue. Instead of bringing some kind of chaos into this, maybe for a short period, but still the parliament, an assembly continuing for 3 years. After that, elections will be held for another 2 years, or things like that. This sort of a thing, will create a lot of chaos in the whole system. And there was actually no need for attempting to do this at this juncture. The government should address itself to various other serious problems which the people face in this country.
Thank you, Mr. Achary. Thank you, Mr. Madhavan. I found this discussion to be very insightful, and I'm sure our readers and listeners will feel the same way. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Welcome. Thank you.